I heard a knock at my door. It was raining heavily. It was a rhythmic tapping, consistent and unrelenting water droplets from a damaged faucet. Tap, 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 and on it continued. I came to the door and looked through the keyhole, but didn't see anybody. I became worried. The knock persisted, so I went back, picked up my baseball bat, and returned to the door. Taking a few breaths, I opened the door after a short count of 1, 2, and 3 in my head. But nobody was in. I looked both sides, but saw no one. It was a high-rise residential building, and I was used to stupid pranks being played on me, mostly by my neighbor's teenage kids. I hated those kids sometimes. As I stepped in to close the door, I felt something brush my side as though trying to get inside. I didn't know what to make of it, so I ignored it. I went back to watching television when a few moments later I heard movement in the kitchen. I disregarded it, but it became too obvious. Now I was scared. Again, I grabbed my bat and headed to the kitchen. I walked in but saw nobody, but I found one of my plates on the table with a knife placed on it. I do not remember ever putting these wares on the table. My heart began to beat fast. A lot of thoughts began to cloud my brain. Suddenly the door to the kitchen got shut. I turned back abruptly, and what I saw made me immediately pee my pants. Standing at the door was a woman. I knew she was a woman because she was looking at me, with her head twisted to the back facing me, but her hands and the rest of her body facing the door. But it was just for a moment. I blinked and she was gone. I had no choice. I dashed through the door, violently opened it, and ran towards the door leading me out of the house. But before I got to the exit, I heard the same tap, but this time louder, but the same consistency. The tap got louder and louder. I remembered my phone was in my pocket. I brought it out with the hope of dialing 911. But as soon as I started dialing, I saw the reflection of the same lady hanging on the roof directly over me. I screamed with all my strength, and the phone fell out of my hands, hitting the ground. I didn't know what to do anymore, so I crawled into a ball, closed my eyes, and began to mutter prayers. After what seemed like 1 minute of thumping on my door, everything stopped. I opened my eyes slowly and saw nothing. I got up and ran as fast as I could, opened the door, and jumped out. I was breathing heavily. After a while, one of my neighbors opened his door, screaming at the top of his lungs. His scream jolted me, and we both began to run to the service elevator of the building. That night I didn't sleep at home. I waited until the next day, got my stuff out of the house. I had just arrived from my trip to an ancient city in rural China, and as I pulled into my isolated compound, the rain poured in torrents, drumming relentlessly against the car windows. The downpour blurred the outlines of the towering trees and overgrown foliage that lined the gravel driveway leading to my home, a sprawling Victorian-era mansion, perched like a forgotten relic in the heart of the property. It had been in my family for generations, though none of my siblings cared much for it. The creaking wood, the musty smell of damp age, the drafts that whispered through the hallways, it was all too much for them. But for me, it was perfect. It suited me as a writer and a person who preferred solitude. The rain added to the gloom of the place, but that was how I liked it. The shadows always seemed deeper when it rained, the air heavier, the silence in the house more profound. I thrived in it. It fed my creativity. It was barely 10 p.m. when I stepped out of the car and into the night, carefully unloading my luggage. The most precious item I carried was an antique mirror I had purchased from a tiny, forgotten shop in that ancient Chinese city. I had been captivated by its Gothic design, the pointed arches on its frame carved from dark, almost black wood, decorated with strange ornate symbols that I couldn't decipher. There was a small crack in the glass, a blemish from centuries of wear, but to me, that only added to its character. It looked like something that belonged in a haunted castle. Once inside, I wasted no time. After dropping my bags by the door, I hung the mirror in the dining room, right beside the grand portrait of my grandfather. The portrait, painted in his later years, had always unnerved me a little. His eyes seemed to follow you around the room, a trick of the artist's hand no doubt, but still unsettling. I glanced at the mirror one last time, marveling at its dark beauty before heading to the kitchen to make a light dinner. The rain outside had softened into a steady patter, and after eating, I retired to bed, feeling the weariness of my journey settle in. I must have barely drifted off when a loud crashing sound jolted me awake. At first, I lay still, blinking in the dark, half convinced it was nothing more than the house settling in the storm. Old houses had a habit of making strange noises. But something about this was different. It was too loud, too deliberate. Grumbling, I swung my legs out of bed and padded down the creaky stairs to investigate. The dining room was cold, the air unusually still. The rain outside seemed to have stopped completely, leaving only a heavy silence in its wake. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out. As I stepped further into the room, my foot nudged something on the floor. The mirror. It had fallen from the wall and lay face down on the wooden floorboards. Frowning, I bent down to lift it. That's when I felt the sharp sting of glass slicing into my finger. I winced and instinctively pulled my hand back, watching as a small bead of blood formed and then, oddly, began to gush, far more than it should have for such a minor cut. At that exact moment, an earth-splitting screech pierced the air, distant but terrifyingly clear, as if it were carried on the wind from miles away. The sound was so unnatural, so inhuman, that I nearly dropped the mirror in shock. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. Trembling, I placed the mirror on the dining table, staring at it as the screeching slowly faded. But as my gaze settled on the glass, my breath caught in my throat. The crack in the mirror, the very crack I had examined earlier, was gone. The damage had vanished. The glass was flawless. I stumbled back, confused, and in my haste, my foot caught on the edge of the table. I tumbled to the floor, landing hard on my back, my head smacking against the ground. The pain shot through me, but worse was the sense of unreality settling in. This wasn't right. None of it was right. As I lay there, dazed and staring up at the ceiling, the screeching returned, closer this time. It seemed to crawl toward me, dragging itself through the walls of the house, reverberating off every surface. Each time it echoed, it grew louder, more guttural, until I could feel it in my bones. It was no longer distant. It was here, right outside the door. The room plunged into darkness. The few candles I had left burning flickered out in unison. The power hadn't returned, and the oppressive silence that followed was almost worse than the screeching. I tried to sit up, but my body refused to move. My limbs felt heavy, and the sharp pain in my head was replaced by a strange numbness. I could still feel the blood from my finger pooling on the floor beneath me, spreading out in a crimson halo. And then the mirror cracked. The sound was soft, like the snapping of dry wood, but it echoed in the stillness of the room. My eyes flicked to the table where the mirror lay. I couldn't see it in the dark, but I felt something was wrong. There was movement. At first, it was slow, almost imperceptible. A shadow, darker than the surrounding night, began to shift behind the glass. It wasn't a reflection. It was something inside the mirror, something struggling, pushing against the surface of the glass as though it were a membrane. I could only watch in horror as the glass began to ripple like the surface of a disturbed pond. The shadow pressed harder, and the mirror bulged outward, its surface no longer solid but fluid. And then it began to pour out. The liquid darkness spilled from the mirror, flowing off the table and onto the floor in thick, tar-like rivulets. It moved with a sinister purpose, slithering across the wooden floorboards until it reached my feet. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was paralyzed with terror as the liquid began to rise, taking shape before me. It grew taller, forming the outline of something humanoid, yet entirely wrong. Its limbs were too long, too thin, like blackened branches stretching unnaturally from its torso. Its head was a formless mass, and yet I could feel its gaze burning into me with a malevolent intensity. The room grew colder, the air thick with the stench of rot and decay. My heart pounded as the figure took its final shape, a towering silhouette of pure darkness, so dense it seemed to absorb the very light around it. The creature leaned down toward me, its head tilting in a grotesque mockery of curiosity. Tears streamed down my face as I lay there, helpless, unable to move, my blood mingling with the darkness that now surrounded me. It paused for a moment, as though savoring the fear that gripped me, then it lunged. Just as its shadowy limbs reached for my throat, I woke up, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I was in my bed, drenched in cold sweat. My head throbbed, and my limbs were sore as if I'd truly fallen. But it had just been a nightmare, a horrible, vivid nightmare. Then, from downstairs, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering, the same sound that had begun the nightmare. I froze, dread pooling in my stomach as I listened to the silence that followed. The mirror had fallen again, and this time, I wasn't sure if I was truly awake. I heard rumors about the school when I first entered the town. 2 students had committed suicide within it in the past 4 years. The students claimed the school was haunted, but it was the only high school in town, and the next town was kilometers away. I was a single parent trying to escape an abusive partner, and I had sworn I would do anything to protect myself and my child from my husband. So, one morning, I got into the family's Chevy with my daughter and drove north. I kept driving and only stopped a few times for gas and food. That was how I ended up here. I knew he would never find me here. 6 months later, I was teaching middle school. The town was a bit odd, but its people were nice. And on this day, we had just completed a PTA meeting. It was almost 7 p.m. Most of the parents and teachers had gone home, but a few lingered outside. I was left alone in the staff room as I finished up a report. I tittied up and headed to the large framed door to an extended corridor that led to the reception and then out of the building. I got to the door, and in that moment, the lights to the entire building flickered. I paused for a moment. It flickered again, but this time, it took time before the light came on, and then I saw it. A lineup of students, covered in blood in a straight line, the entire length of the hall. I screamed in fear, and immediately the lights came back on. The hall was empty. I was not with my phone. There was no way I could call anyone to come get me. I waited a few more minutes to see if the light would go off again. It didn't. So, with all the courage I had, I opened the door, hoping to dash through the hall at light speed. But as I stepped into the hall, the light went off. I turned around, and in horror, tried opening up the door, but it wouldn't open. My eyes caught a reflection of a student on fire in the middle of the hall. I banged violently at the door trying to open it, till I began to bleed on my hands, yet the door wouldn't open. The light came on, and everything went back to normal. I made a dash, running with my eyes closed, with the hope I could reach the end of the hallway quick enough to escape. I must have run for about 2 seconds when a hand grabbed my feet from behind. I fell, violently slamming into the ground. I opened my eyes and the hallway was dark. I looked behind me, and at the far end was a wooden chair on fire, and on it sat a headless child. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. I was tired and in shock. I looked in front of me, and there was another kid hanging from the ceiling with a golden chain on fire wrapped tightly around its neck. The lights came up, and everything returned to normal. I dragged myself up as I limped in painful steps towards the exit of the hallway. That was when I realized the floor of the hall was wet. I looked down and I saw blood. It was rising steadily. The light was a solace. At least I could see. By the time I got to the door, the blood had risen to the level of my ankle. I opened the door, and thankfully it did. I stepped out, and a cold and dark wind blew across my body, leaving me in shock, and I passed out. I woke up suddenly and found myself in the staff room. There were teachers around. I had fallen asleep with my head on the table. Was it all a dream? My mind raced. We were just a few minutes away from the PTA. It was all a dream.